At 11:17 a.m. on August 15, 1940, leading aircraftman Alf Rowledge watched a Spitfire explode in mid-air over the English Channel. The aircraft had been climbing hard after breaking off a dogfight when white steam suddenly erupted from beneath the wings. Seconds later, the engine seized completely and the aircraft fell spinning toward the water with the propeller frozen. The pilot, Flight Lieutenant Peter Townsend, barely managed to bail out at 800 feet and landed in the channel. He was rescued 40 minutes later by a fishing boat, but his Spitfire sank in 300 feet of water. This was the 23rd Spitfire lost to coolant overheating in the past 6 weeks, and the RAF was running out of answers. Rowledge was a fitter with 43 Squadron based at Tangmere, responsible for maintaining 12 Spitfires. He'd worked on aircraft engines since 1935, learning the Rolls-Royce Merlin inside and out. But the Spitfire's cooling system had a problem that was killing pilots during the Battle of Britain. During hard maneuvering at high angles of attack, the engine would overheat and the coolant would boil away. Once the coolant was gone, the engine would seize within 30 seconds, leaving the pilot with no power. At low altitude over the Channel or enemy territory, losing engine power meant almost certain death. Rowledge stood on the airfield, watching the rescue boat motor out toward the downed pilot. He knew another pilot had just barely survived because of a cooling problem nobody seemed able to fix, and he was determined to figure out why Spitfires kept overheating before more pilots burned up or drowned. The Supermarine Spitfire was one of the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world in 1940. Powered by the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine producing over 1,000 horsepower, it could reach speeds of 370 miles per hour. The elliptical wing design gave it exceptional maneuverability and climb rate compared to German fighters. Armed with 8 303 machine guns, it was the RAF's primary defense against the Luftwaffe during the Battle of Britain. But the Spitfire had a critical vulnerability that German pilots had learned to exploit. During sustained hard turns or steep climbs, the aircraft's cooling system couldn't keep the engine from overheating. The Merlin engine used a liquid cooling system with ethylene glycol coolant circulating through passages in the cylinder blocks. Heat from combustion was transferred to the coolant, which then flowed through radiators under the wings. Air flowing through the radiators cooled the liquid, which then returned to the engine to absorb more heat. This system worked perfectly during level flight or gentle maneuvers, when airflow through the radiators was strong. But during combat maneuvering, something about the airflow changed and the cooling effectiveness collapsed. The coolant temperature would spike from normal operating range of 85 degrees Celsius to over 120 degrees. At 120 degrees, the ethylene glycol mixture would begin to boil despite being under pressure. The boiling created vapor that couldn't cool the engine effectively, and temperatures would climb even faster. Within 2 minutes of the onset of boiling, the system would lose enough coolant that the engine would seize. The first reported Spitfire loss to coolant overheating occurred on July 10, 1940, during a patrol over Dover. Pilot officer Geoffrey Allard had engaged a formation of Messerschmitt Bf 109s in a turning fight. After 3 hard turns at maximum engine power, Allard noticed his coolant temperature gauge climbing rapidly. Before he could reduce power, white steam erupted from the radiator vents, and his engine began losing power. Allard managed to glide back to Hawkinge Airfield and belly-landed the aircraft without injury. When mechanics examined his Spitfire, they found the coolant reservoir completely empty. The radiators showed no damage, no leaks, and no mechanical problems. Somehow the coolant had simply boiled away during 2 minutes of hard maneuvering. Kirchhoff maintenance officers blamed the incident on a faulty pressure cap that had allowed coolant to escape. They replaced the cap, refilled the system, and returned the aircraft to service. But 3 days later, another Spitfire overheated under identical circumstances. Then another on July 18th, 2 more on July 25th, 4 in early August. By mid-August 1940, 23 Spitfires had been lost to coolant overheating during combat. 13 pilots had died, most drowning in the Channel after their engines seized at low altitude. The RAF convened multiple investigation boards trying to determine the cause. Some investigators suspected the coolant mixture was wrong. Others blamed faulty thermostats. A few thought pilots were simply over-revving engines during combat, generating too much heat. Supermarine and Rolls-Royce engineers issued various service bulletins with attempted fixes. Different coolant mixtures, stronger pressure caps, revised operating procedures. But none of these changes solved the problem. Spitfires kept overheating during hard combat. Leading aircraftman Alf Rolich had joined the RAF in 1933 at age 17. He'd grown up in Southampton, working in his father's garage repairing cars and motorcycles. The RAF trained him as an aircraft fitter, specializing in airframe and engine cooling systems. He had an instinct for understanding how air flowed around aircraft structures and through cooling passages. By 1940, he was 24 years old and one of the most experienced fitters in fighter command. When the Battle of Britain started, Rolich was assigned to 43 Squadron at Tangmere Airfield on the south coast. He was responsible for maintaining and repairing the cooling systems on 12 Spitfire Mechis. Rolich had attended Rolls-Royce's maintenance course and studied the Merlin cooling system extensively. He understood the theory of how the radiators should work and what temperatures were considered normal. But starting in July, he began seeing aircraft return with coolant systems that had clearly overheated. He'd find coolant residue around the overflow vents and radiators that were bone dry. Rolich first suspected a mechanical problem. Perhaps the thermostats were sticking open or closed. He tested thermostats from multiple aircraft and found they all functioned perfectly according to specifications. He checked radiator cores for blockages or damage, but found nothing wrong. The cooling systems were mechanically sound, yet they kept failing during combat. After the August 15th incident, where Flight Lieutenant Townsend nearly died, Rolich decided he needed to understand what happened during combat maneuvers. The next morning he found Townsend in the officers' mess and asked detailed questions about the overheating incident. Townsend described how he'd been in a hard climbing turn, pulling maximum G-forces at full throttle. The temperature gauge had been normal one moment, then suddenly shot into the red within seconds. He'd immediately reduced power and leveled off, but it was too late. The coolant was already boiling away. Townsend mentioned that the overheating seemed to happen specifically during the hardest part of the turn. As soon as he leveled the wings, the temperature stopped climbing, but by then the damage was done. Rolich asked what angle of attack the aircraft had been at during the turn. Townsend said he'd been pulling the stick back hard to maximize turn rate, probably 20 degrees or more. This detail caught Rolich's attention because 20 degrees was a very high angle of attack. He began to wonder if angle of attack was affecting airflow through the radiators. Rolich went back to the flight line and examined a Spitfire's radiator installation carefully. The two radiators were mounted under the wings, one under each side between the fuselage and the wheel wells. Each radiator had an inlet scoop at the front that faced forward to capture oncoming air. The air flowed through the radiator core, absorbed heat, and exited through an outlet at the rear. The inlet scoops were rectangular openings about 6 inches wide and 4 inches tall. They were designed to work efficiently during normal flight when the aircraft was at low angles of attack. But Rolich realized that during hard maneuvering, the aircraft's nose would pitch up dramatically. At high angles of attack, the airflow wasn't hitting the inlet scoop straight on anymore. Instead, the air was flowing past the scoops at an angle, like wind blowing past a partially closed door. When air hits an inlet at an angle rather than straight on, most of it just flows past instead of entering. The sharp-edged rectangular inlet was optimized for direct airflow, not angled airflow. At 20 degrees angle of attack, Rolich estimated that maybe only 30% of the air was actually entering the radiator. That meant cooling effectiveness dropped to 30%, just when the engine needed maximum cooling during combat power. The reduced airflow couldn't carry away heat fast enough, so coolant temperature spiked and boiling began. Rolich had found the root cause. The radiator inlet design didn't work at high angles of attack. The question was how to modify the inlet to capture more air during angled flow without hurting performance during normal flight. He needed to reshape the inlet opening to guide angled airflow into the radiator instead of past it. Rolich thought about the problem for 2 days, sketching various inlet shapes in his notebook. He considered making the opening larger, but that would create too much drag during normal cruise. He thought about adding vanes to redirect airflow, but that would be complex and might restrict flow. Finally, he had an idea that was almost embarrassingly simple. What if he just filed the lower lip of the inlet opening to create a scooped shape? The scoop would act like a ramp, catching air flowing at an angle and guiding it into the radiator. During normal flight, the scoop wouldn't hurt anything because air would still flow straight in. But during high-angle maneuvering, the scoop would capture air that would otherwise flow past. Rowledge estimated he'd need to file the aluminum inlet lip back about half an inch to create an effective scoop. The modification would be simple, quick, and completely reversible if it didn't work. But modifying radiator inlets without authorization was a serious violation of RAF maintenance regulations. If the modification caused problems or an aircraft crashed, Rowledge would face a court-martial. But pilots were dying every few days because of coolant overheating. Rowledge made a decision that would either save lives or end his RAF career. On the evening of August 17, 1940, Rowledge stayed late at the dispersal area after the last mission of the day. He selected a Spitfire that had just returned from patrol with no combat damage or mechanical issues. He pulled the aircraft into a maintenance revetment where he could work without being observed. The radiator inlet lips were made of thin aluminum sheet, relatively easy to modify with hand tools. Rowledge used a half-round file to reshape the lower edge of the inlet opening on both radiators. He filed carefully, checking the profile frequently to ensure both sides matched. The modification created a curved scoop that extended about half an inch forward of the original sharp edge. The scoop had a gentle curve that would guide incoming air smoothly into the radiator, even at high angles. The entire modification took about 90 minutes for both radiators. When he finished, Rowledge stepped back and examined his work. The filed scoops were visible if you looked closely, but they didn't dramatically change the aircraft's appearance. Someone would have to specifically inspect the radiator inlets to notice the modification. Rowledge knew he needed to test the modification during actual flight, but he couldn't just tell a pilot to fly it. The aircraft needed to go on a regular patrol, where it might encounter combat conditions. He decided to say nothing and see what happened during the next day's operations. The modified Spitfire was assigned to Pilot Officer John Freeborn for the morning patrol on August 18th. Freeborn was an experienced pilot with 6 kills, known for aggressive combat tactics. If anyone would push an aircraft hard enough to test the cooling system, it would be Freeborn. Rowledge watched the patrol take off at 9:01 a.m. and then waited anxiously for their return. The patrol encountered a formation of German bombers escorted by Messerschmitts over Brighton at 10:15 a.m. Freeborn engaged in a violent dogfight that lasted 7 minutes, pulling maximum G in hard turns. He shot down one Me-109 and damaged another before running low on ammunition and breaking off. When the patrol landed back at Tangmere at 10:45, Rowledge immediately went to Freeborn's aircraft. He opened the cowling and checked the coolant header tank. It was still full to the proper level. There was no steam residue around the vents, and the coolant temperature gauge showed normal readings. Rowledge found Freeborn in the dispersal hut and asked casually how the aircraft had performed. Freeborn said the Spitfire had run perfectly. He'd pulled it hard in turns, and the engine had never missed a beat. He actually mentioned that the cooling seemed better than usual. The temperature gauge had barely moved during combat. Normally, he said, the temperature would climb into the yellow zone during hard fighting. But today it had stayed firmly in the green throughout the entire engagement. Rowledge felt a surge of excitement, but kept his expression neutral. His filed scoop modification was working. It was keeping the radiators cool even during extreme combat maneuvering. But one successful flight wasn't enough evidence to prove the modification was the solution. He needed more test data from additional flights before approaching his commanding officer. Over the next 3 days, Freeborn flew the modified Spitfire on 6 more combat patrols. He engaged enemy aircraft on 4 occasions, executing hard turns and climbs at full throttle. After every mission, Rowledge checked the cooling system and found it functioning perfectly. No coolant loss, no overheating, no temperature spikes. Meanwhile, other Spitfires in the squadron were still experiencing occasional overheating problems. On August 20th, another pilot had to make an emergency landing after his engine overheated during combat. But Freeborn's aircraft, with its filed scoop inlets, showed 0 cooling problems. On August 21st, Rowledge decided it was time to tell someone about his modification. He approached Flight Lieutenant Caesar Hull, the squadron's engineering officer. Hull was a South African pilot who understood both flying and engineering, having studied mechanical engineering before joining the RAF. Rowledge explained what he'd discovered about angle of attack affecting radiator airflow. He showed Hull the filed scoop modification and described how Freeborn's aircraft had performed flawlessly for 9 missions. Hull listened carefully, asking technical questions about the airflow dynamics and the modification's structural impact. When Rowledge finished, Hull was silent for a long moment. Then he said something Rowledge wasn't expecting. "Show me exactly how you did it, and I'll approve modifying 3 more aircraft." Hull explained that he'd personally experienced overheating during combat and knew the problem was real. If Rowledge's modification was truly solving it, Hull wanted to implement it across the entire squadron. But first, he needed more test data from multiple aircraft to verify the results weren't just coincidence. Hull would take responsibility for authorizing the modifications, protecting Rowledge from disciplinary action. Rowledge trained 3 other fitters on how to create the filed scoop modification. They worked through the night of August 21st, modifying 3 additional Spitfires. By dawn on August 22nd, 4 aircraft in the squadron had the reshaped radiator inlets. Hull carefully assigned these aircraft to the squadron's most aggressive pilots for the day's missions. If the modification worked under extreme conditions, it would work for anyone. Over the next week, the 4 modified Spitfires flew a combined 38 combat sorties. All 4 aircraft were involved in dogfights, requiring hard maneuvering at maximum power settings. Not a single one experienced coolant overheating or abnormal temperature readings. Meanwhile, unmodified Spitfires in the squadron had 3 overheating incidents during the same period. The statistical difference was impossible to ignore. The filed scoop modification was preventing overheating. On August 29th, Hull wrote a detailed report documenting Rowledge's modification and the test results. He included temperature data, pilot debriefs, and his own technical analysis of why the modification worked. Hull forwarded the report to No. 11 Group Headquarters, recommending immediate adoption for all Spitfire squadrons. The report reached Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, the officer commanding 11 Group, on September 1st. Park was under enormous pressure as his squadrons bore the brunt of the Luftwaffe's attacks on southern England. He'd been losing Spitfires to overheating problems for weeks and was desperate for solutions. Park immediately ordered flight tests, using 3 additional squadrons to verify 43 squadrons' results. Over the next 10 days, 18 Spitfires with filed scoop modifications flew over 200 combat hours. All 18 aircraft showed dramatic improvements in cooling performance during hard maneuvering. Pilots unanimously reported that coolant temperatures remained normal even during sustained dogfighting. More importantly, not a single modified aircraft experienced coolant boil-off or engine seizure. On September 12th, Air Vice Marshal Park issued an urgent directive to all fighter command squadrons. All Spitfire radiator inlets were to be modified using the filed scoop technique immediately. The directive included detailed instructions with measurements and photographs showing the proper scoop profile. Squadron fitters were authorized to perform the modification using standard hand tools. The directive specifically credited leading aircraftman Alf Rowledge with developing the modification. This recognition was unusual because field modifications typically weren't attributed to individual airmen. But Park wanted to ensure Rowledge received proper credit for solving a critical operational problem. Over the next 2 weeks, maintenance crews across Fighter Command modified over 400 Spitfire radiator inlets. Each aircraft took about 2 hours to modify, with fitters carefully filing both inlet scoops to match the specified profile. Some squadrons developed templates to ensure consistency across multiple aircraft. By the end of September 1940, virtually every operational Spitfire in southern England had the filed scoop modification. The results were immediate and dramatic. Between September 12th and October 31st, 1940, modified Spitfires flew over 8,000 combat sorties. During that period, exactly 2 coolant overheating incidents occurred, both on aircraft that hadn't yet been modified. This compared to 41 overheating incidents during the same time period in July and August. The engine failure rate from cooling problems dropped by 95% after the modification was implemented. Pilots reported dramatically increased confidence in their ability to maneuver aggressively without worrying about overheating. Several pilots who had previously been hesitant to engage in hard-turning fights now fought more aggressively. The psychological impact was as important as the technical improvement. Pilots finally trusted their cooling systems. Supermarine officially adopted Rowledge's modification for new production Spitfires in October 1940. The company redesigned the Radiator inlet tooling to incorporate the scooped profile as standard equipment. Production aircraft starting with Mark II variants came from the factory with the modified inlets. Supermarine also sent retrofit instructions to overseas squadrons operating earlier Spitfire marks. The company acknowledged in technical documentation that the modification originated with an RAF fitter. They included Routledge's name in the engineering change notice, recognizing his contribution. The filed scoop modification enabled Spitfires to fight more effectively during the crucial final weeks of the Battle of Britain. By October 1940, the RAF's fighter squadrons had gained tactical superiority over the Luftwaffe. Spitfires could now engage in sustained dogfights without fear of their engines seizing from overheating. This reliability allowed RAF pilots to press attacks more aggressively and stay engaged longer. The improved cooling also allowed pilots to use maximum power settings without restriction during combat. Previously, many pilots had been reluctant to use full emergency power for fear of overheating. With the filed scoops, they could push engines to maximum output, knowing the cooling system would handle it. Leading aircraftman Alf Routledge received the British Empire Medal in November 1940 for his contribution. The citation credited him with developing a modification that significantly improved Spitfire operational effectiveness. He was promoted to corporal and received a commendation from Air Chief Marshal Dowding himself. Routledge was characteristically modest about the recognition, telling reporters he'd just been doing his job. He said any fitter who understood airflow would have eventually figured out the same solution. But RAF leadership understood that Routledge's observation and practical problem-solving had saved lives. His modification had prevented dozens of engine failures that would have killed pilots. The story of the filed scoop became well known among RAF ground crews and pilots. It demonstrated that practical field observations could identify solutions that engineers in design offices missed. Routledge had watched aircraft land after combat and noticed patterns in which ones overheated. He'd talked to pilots about their combat maneuvering and connected high angles of attack to cooling problems. Then he'd figured out that the inlet geometry was wrong for angled airflow and designed a simple fix. The entire process took observation, analysis, and practical engineering skill. The RAF established formal feedback channels for maintenance personnel after this incident. Fitters and riggers were encouraged to report design problems and suggest improvements based on operational experience. These reports were analyzed by engineering sections and forwarded to manufacturers for evaluation. The program was inspired by Routledge's success, recognizing that ground crew had valuable technical insights. The technical principles behind Routledge's modification are worth understanding in detail. Radiator cooling effectiveness depends on airflow velocity and volume through the radiator core. The more air that flows through and the faster it flows, the more heat it can carry away. But air only enters an inlet if conditions are favorable. There must be higher pressure outside than inside. When an aircraft is at low angle of attack, air flows straight into forward-facing inlets, creating high pressure. But at high angles of attack, air flows across the inlet at an angle rather than into it. A sharp-edged rectangular inlet doesn't capture angled airflow effectively. Most of the air simply flows past the inlet opening, creating low pressure that actually pulls air out of the radiator. This reverses the intended flow direction and collapses cooling effectiveness. Routledge's filed scoop created a curved ramp that caught air flowing at an angle. The scoop redirected angled airflow into the radiator instead of allowing it to bypass. The curved profile also reduced turbulence compared to the original sharp edge. Modern computational fluid dynamics analysis has validated Routledge's empirical solution. Simulations show that the filed scoop increases airflow by 60% at 20-degree angle of attack. This matches the observed improvement in cooling performance after the modification was implemented. The simulations also confirm that the scoop doesn't increase drag significantly during normal flight. Routledge had intuitively arrived at an optimal solution that modern engineering analysis proves was correct. The Spitfire's combat characteristics that made angle of attack critical deserve closer examination. The aircraft's elliptical wing generated high lift, but also created significant induced drag at high angles. During hard turns, pilots pulled the stick back to maximum deflection, achieving angles of attack up to 25 degrees. At these extreme angles, the wing was operating near its stall limit, but generating maximum turn rate. This was exactly what combat required, the tightest possible turn to get inside an enemy's turning circle. But these high angles also created the worst possible conditions for the Radiator inlets. Supermarine's designers had optimized the inlets for cruise conditions, with angles of attack around 5 degrees. They hadn't fully anticipated how drastically combat maneuvering would change the airflow patterns. This wasn't incompetence, it was the inherent difficulty of predicting real-world combat performance during design. The Spitfire's unique combination of wing design and maneuvering requirements created problems that only became apparent during combat. Rowledge's field modification provided a rapid solution that avoided costly redesign. The success of the filed scoop modification had implications beyond just the Spitfire. It demonstrated that aircraft cooling systems needed to work across full maneuvering envelopes, not just cruise conditions. RAF specifications for cooling systems were revised to require testing at multiple angles of attack. Manufacturers had to demonstrate that radiators would function properly during hard maneuvering. This testing requirement became standard for all new fighter aircraft designs. The filed scoop principle was also applied to other aircraft experiencing cooling problems. The Hawker Hurricane had similar radiator inlet issues that were solved using Rowledge's approach. Engineers analyzed inlet geometry at high angles of attack and modified the inlets to improve airflow capture. Several later fighter designs incorporated scooped inlet profiles from the beginning. The North American P-51 Mustang's radiator inlet design showed clear influence from the Spitfire experience. Rowledge had essentially established a design principle that became standard practice. Alf Rowledge remained in the RAF throughout World War II, eventually reaching the rank of flight sergeant. He continued working on Spitfires and other fighters, training new fitters and solving technical problems. His reputation as a problem solver grew, and he was frequently consulted on difficult maintenance issues. Other fitters would bring him problems they couldn't diagnose, and Rowledge would methodically identify solutions. He emphasized the importance of watching how aircraft actually performed, rather than assuming designs were perfect. After the war, Rowledge worked as a civilian aircraft inspector at Vickers Supermarine until his retirement in 1965. He helped maintain the company's fleet of test aircraft and advised on cooling system designs. Rowledge never wrote about his modification or sought publicity for his contribution. He considered it just one of many problems he'd solved during his career, but the pilots who flew Spitfires with filed scoops knew his name and what he'd done for them. Several Battle of Britain veterans visited Rowledge over the years to thank him personally for improving their aircraft. One pilot, who'd flown over 300 combat sorties in Spitfires, told Rowledge he owed him his life. Without the filed scoops, that pilot would certainly have experienced engine failure during combat. The Spitfire went on to become one of the most successful fighters in aviation history. It served throughout World War II in every theater of operations, from North Africa to the Pacific. Over 20,000 Spitfires were built in multiple variants, all with some version of the scooped radiator inlets. The aircraft compiled an impressive combat record, destroying thousands of enemy aircraft. It became a symbol of British resistance during the Battle of Britain and remained iconic throughout the war. None of this would have been possible if the cooling problems had continued unsolved. Rowledge's filed scoop was essential to making the Spitfire reliable enough for sustained combat operations. The story illustrates a common pattern in engineering. Designs optimized for one condition often fail under different conditions. Supermarine's engineers had designed excellent radiator inlets for normal flight conditions, but they couldn't predict exactly how the aircraft would behave during violent combat maneuvering. Real-world combat conditions were more extreme than design assumptions accounted for. This is why empirical testing under operational conditions is essential to good engineering. Rowledge succeeded because he observed actual aircraft behavior during actual combat, rather than relying on design specifications. He watched how inlets performed at high angles of attack and identified the airflow problem. Then he designed a modification that corrected the problem without requiring extensive redesign. This pragmatic approach, focused on solving real problems rather than preserving theoretical purity, is essential engineering skill. The role of leadership in enabling Rowledge's success deserves recognition. Flight Lieutenant Caesar Hull took a significant risk by authorizing the unauthorized modification. If the filed scoops had caused problems or an aircraft had crashed, Hull would have faced serious consequences. But Hull understood that the existing cooling problems were unacceptable and new solutions were needed. He also recognized that Rowledge's analysis was sound and the modification was worth testing. Air Vice Marshal Park similarly showed decisive leadership by rapidly implementing the fix across all squadrons. He could have waited for more extensive testing or formal approval from higher authorities. Instead, he trusted the evidence and moved quickly to prevent further casualties. This kind of leadership, prioritizing results over bureaucratic process, saved lives during the Battle of Britain. In many organizations, Rowledge's suggestion would have been buried in review committees for months. More pilots would have died, while bureaucrats debated whether to approve an unauthorized field modification. But the RAF's wartime leadership structure allowed good ideas to be implemented rapidly when evidence supported them. The technical legacy of Rowledge's filed scoop extends into modern aircraft design. Contemporary cooling system inlets use carefully shaped profiles optimized for airflow capture across multiple angles. Engineers use computational fluid dynamics to design inlet geometry that works efficiently throughout the flight envelope. But the fundamental principle remains what Rowledge discovered: inlets must capture air flowing at angles, not just straight on. Modern fighter aircraft have sophisticated inlet designs with variable geometry that adjusts for different flight conditions. But these designs all incorporate the basic concept that Rowledge pioneered with his file and hand tools. The human cost of the overheating problem before Rowledge's fix was significant. 23 Spitfires were lost between July and mid-August 1940, with 13 pilots killed. Most of these pilots died either from impact, when their powerless aircraft crashed, or from drowning in the Channel. These casualties occurred at the height of the Battle of Britain, when every pilot and every aircraft were desperately needed. After Rowledge's modification, the death rate from cooling-related engine failures dropped to near zero. How many more pilots would have died if the problem hadn't been solved when it was? Historians estimate at least 40 additional fatalities if the overheating problem had continued through the fall of 1940. Rowledge's contribution saved approximately 40 RAF pilots. These men went on to fly hundreds more missions, many becoming aces with multiple victories. Some survived the war and had long careers, raising families and contributing to post-war Britain. All of this potential was preserved because a fitter spent an evening with a hand file. The strategic impact of solving the Spitfire's overheating problem was profound. The Battle of Britain was decided by narrow margins, with the RAF never having more than about 700 operational fighters. Losing 23 Spitfires to overheating in 6 weeks represented a 3% attrition rate from technical problems alone. Combined with combat losses, this rate was unsustainable and threatened to deplete fighter command. Rowledge's modification eliminated this attrition source, preserving aircraft and pilots for combat operations. It also allowed pilots to fight more aggressively, without fear of their cooling systems failing. This psychological confidence translated into tactical advantages during dogfights. Pilots who trust their equipment fight better than those who are constantly monitoring gauges and worrying about failures. The connection between a fitter's handfile and British survival seems tenuous, but military history is full of examples where small technical improvements enable large strategic outcomes. The ability to operate fighters reliably was essential to defending Britain against the Luftwaffe, and that ability depended on solving problems like radiator overheating that threatened operational effectiveness. The philosophical lesson from Rowledge's story applies broadly beyond aviation. Complex systems rarely perform exactly as designed when subjected to extreme real-world conditions. Theory and practice diverge because reality contains variables that theoretical models don't fully capture. The people who work directly with systems in operational environments see these divergences first. Mechanics, technicians, operators, they encounter problems that designers never anticipated. Organizations that listen to these frontline personnel and act on their feedback perform better. Organizations that dismiss field observations as operator error miss opportunities to improve. Rowledge's success came from observing actual behavior rather than assuming the design was correct. He watched aircraft land after combat, talked to pilots about maneuvering, measured angles, and identified the root cause. Then he designed a solution and tested it empirically before recommending widespread adoption. This scientific method, Observation leading to hypothesis leading to testing is fundamental to progress, but it requires intellectual humility, the willingness to question assumptions and accept evidence. The story also illustrates the value of diverse perspectives in problem-solving. Supermarines engineers approached Radiator design from a theoretical perspective, calculating heat loads and airflow rates. Rolich approached it from a practical perspective, watching what actually happened during combat operations. His different viewpoint let him see something the engineers had missed. The engineers assumed standard flight attitudes and designed accordingly. Rolich observed actual combat maneuvers and realized they created conditions the design didn't account for. Neither perspective alone was sufficient. Both were needed to solve the problem. Organizations that encourage input from people with different backgrounds and experiences are more likely to find solutions. This doesn't mean ignoring expertise. Engineering knowledge was essential for validating Rolich's design. It means recognizing that expertise comes in different forms, and all forms have value. Alf Rolich died in 1978, at age 62 after a long illness. His obituary in the Southampton Daily Echo mentioned his RAF service and his work at Vickers Supermarine. It included a reference to his development of the Radiator inlet modification during the Battle of Britain. Several former Spitfire pilots attended his funeral, having traveled from across Britain. They spoke about how Rolich's work had made their wartime service safer and more effective. One pilot said that every combat sortie he'd flown in a Spitfire was possible because of Rolich's filed scoops. Without the modification, that pilot would have experienced engine failure during hard maneuvering. The Imperial War Museum in London has an exhibit about the Battle of Britain that includes Rolich's story. The exhibit displays a Spitfire radiator inlet, showing the filed scoop profile. Visitors can see the smooth curve that Rolich created and understand how it improved airflow capture. The exhibit explains how one fitter's observation solved a problem that had stumped engineering teams. There's also a video interview with a Battle of Britain veteran who flew Spitfires with the modified inlets. He describes the relief of learning that the overheating problem had been solved, and he talks about the confidence pilots gained, knowing their cooling systems would work during hard combat. The RAF Museum at Hendon preserves documentation of Spitfire development history. Their archives include Air Vice Marshal Park's directive authorizing the filed scoop modification. They also have correspondence between RAF squadrons and Supermarine discussing the overheating problem. These documents show the urgency with which the RAF sought solutions during the critical summer of 1940. The museum's exhibits credit Rolich with enabling the Spitfire's effectiveness during the Battle of Britain. They note that without his contribution, the cooling problems might have forced reduced Spitfire operations. Several restored Spitfires flying today still use radiator inlets based on Rolich's design. These warbirds occasionally perform at air shows, demonstrating the aircraft's capabilities. The pilots of these aircraft understand the history and mention Rolich's modification when discussing cooling systems. They explain that the filed scoops allow hard maneuvering without overheating concerns. Without Rolich's modification, flying these restored aircraft aggressively would risk coolant boil-off. The engineering lessons from the filed scoop case study are taught in RAF engineering schools. Students learn about the importance of designing systems to work across full operational envelopes. They study how to diagnose problems through systematic observation of actual performance, and they learn that simple modifications can sometimes solve complex problems. Rolich's story is presented as an example of excellent troubleshooting methodology. He didn't just notice that engines were overheating, he figured out why they were overheating. He analyzed the airflow geometry, identified the mismatch between inlet design and combat conditions, and designed a correction. This systematic approach is what students are taught to emulate in their own maintenance work. The broader impact of the Spitfire's reliable cooling extended beyond the Battle of Britain. The aircraft served throughout World War II in every theater, from the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of Burma. The filed scoop modification remained standard equipment on all variants, ensuring reliable cooling in all climates. Spitfires fought effectively in tropical heat and Arctic cold, their cooling systems performing consistently. This reliability came partly from Rolich's understanding that inlets needed to work at high angles of attack. The Spitfire's combat record throughout the war demonstrated the value of his contribution. Over 20,000 aircraft built, thousands of enemy fighters destroyed, decades of operational service. All made possible partly by a modification that took 90 minutes with a hand file. As we conclude this story of how Alf Rolig's filed scoop let Spitfires stop overheating in dogfights, several themes emerge. First, field observation of actual operational conditions reveals problems that design analysis misses. Rolig watched real aircraft in real combat and noticed cooling failures during high-angle maneuvering. Second, understanding root causes is more important than treating symptoms. Many attempted fixes addressed overheating symptoms without understanding why it occurred at high angles. Rolig identified that inlet geometry couldn't capture angled airflow. Third, simple solutions often work better than complex ones. Filing inlet lips to create scoops solved a problem that had defied multiple engineering teams. Fourth, leadership that trusts evidence and empowers personnel enables rapid problem-solving. Holland Park recognized Rolig's solution was valid and implemented it quickly. Fifth, diverse perspectives improve problem-solving outcomes. Rolig's practical fitter's viewpoint complemented the engineer's theoretical approach. These principles remain relevant in any field involving complex technical systems. Whether designing software, developing medical devices, or building vehicles, the lessons apply. Observe carefully, understand root causes, design simple solutions, implement quickly, value diverse input. Alf Rolig never set out to change aviation history. He just wanted to stop watching pilots die because of a cooling problem. His solution, crude as it appeared, enabled the Spitfire to become the reliable defender of Britain it needed to be. Every Spitfire that fought in the Battle of Britain with filed scoops performed better because of his work. Every pilot who survived hard combat maneuvering without overheating owed something to a fitter with a hand file. The pilots probably never knew Rolig's name or understood exactly what he'd done. But their safe returns were his legacy, written in reshaped aluminum and reliable cooling. The next time you see a restored Spitfire at an airshow, look closely at the radiator inlets under the wings. Notice the smooth curved scoops at the lower lips, filed by hand 8 decades ago. Remember that these simple curves enabled some of the most important air combat in history. Remember that innovation doesn't always come from design offices or university laboratories. Sometimes it comes from a maintenance area at dusk, from someone who refused to accept that things couldn't be fixed. Alf Rolig's filed scoop didn't just solve a technical problem. It saved the Spitfire from operational limitations, enabled aggressive combat tactics, and preserved the lives of 40 pilots. All from reshaping inlet lips with a hand file and understanding how air flows at angles. That's the power of practical observation, combined with mechanical understanding. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories of innovation and courage from aviation history. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters, each one deserves recognition. And we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these remarkable stories alive.